What would you do if the very priests who claimed to protect your soul were the same ones engineering the most terrifying fate for anyone who dared question them? The world remembers Moloch as a god of fire, sacrifice, and relentless devotion, but few dare to explore what happened when a follower stepped out of line. Hidden beneath centuries of ash and silence lies a darker truth, one so unsettling that even the scribes of the cult hesitated to record it. And it all begins with a single, forbidden act: disobedience. The ancient cult of Moloch was not merely a religion. It was an ecosystem of fear, loyalty, and absolute control. Every chant, every ritual, every flame rising from the great braziers was part of a machinery designed to bind the human spirit in obedience. The priests were not just spiritual leaders. They were the guardians of a code that demanded absolute submission, a code whispered in cavern temples, etched into sacrificial altars, and reinforced by rituals that no outsider ever survived. But what happened when someone broke that code? When a worshipper dared to think, to question, to flee? That is where the darkest stories begin. Picture a renegade standing before the temple steps, believing they could simply walk away. They had no idea the priests had already marked them, that their name had been carved into the clay tablets reserved for those who defied the flame. From the moment they hesitated in a ritual, missed a sacrifice, or whispered doubt in the wrong ear, the priests of Moloch considered them spiritually infected. To the cult, doubt was a disease, and the cure was always designed to be worse than the sin. The renegades never faced immediate punishment. That was part of the horror. The priests understood the psychology of fear better than any ruler or conqueror of their age. They allowed doubt to fester, allowing the renegade to believe, for a moment, that they had escaped. They let them sleep, eat, live. Then, when the renegade least expected it, the priests would appear beneath the cover of night, or in the middle of a crowded marketplace, always silent, always watching. Because the first step of the punishment was not pain. It was erosion of the mind. But even this was only the beginning. There were deeper rituals, secret chambers, and ceremonies that the renegades would soon face. And the scribes who recorded these events did so with trembling hands, knowing that what they witnessed could not be spoken aloud without risking their own place among the faithful. Now, before we continue, tell me in the comments what you think drives a cult to punish doubt so fiercely. If this kind of hidden history intrigues you, make sure to hit the like button and check whether you are already subscribed to the channel. What comes next might challenge everything you thought you knew about ancient faith. And this is only the first step into the shadows that shaped the fate of those who tried to escape Moloch. The priests of Moloch did not emerge from ordinary society, nor were they shaped by the same fears that governed the lives of common worshippers. Their formation began in secrecy, long before any public ritual ever revealed their presence. Boys selected for the priesthood were taken as children, often before they could even speak the names of their parents, and escorted into the inner sanctums of the temple where daylight rarely penetrated. There, surrounded by the heat of the eternal flames and the whispers of elder priests, they were taught that their lives no longer belonged to themselves, but to the God who demanded obedience, sacrifice, and absolute silence. Over the years, this isolation molded them into vessels of doctrine, sculpted not by compassion, but by the relentless expectation that weakness was equivalent to betrayal. Every lesson they absorbed served a single purpose: to detach them from earthly attachments and bind them to the rituals that defined Moloch's will. They memorized the IDP sacred codes, learned the cycles of offerings, and were exposed to ceremonies that scarred their minds long before they performed them on others. Elders administered trials that tested their endurance and loyalty, forcing them to confront fear in controlled, suffocating environments. Failure was not punished by death. It was punished by being cast out, a fate considered far worse, for an expelled trainee became marked as spiritually tainted. That fear alone shaped the priests more effectively than pain ever could. As they matured, the initiates were entrusted with secrets so closely guarded that even the highest-ranking scribes were forbidden from recording them. The priests learned the hidden significance behind the flames, the symbols carved into the temple stones, the chants that were never spoken publicly. Over time, these teachings seeped into their identity, weaving a strict hierarchy where obedience flowed upward and control flowed downward. It was within this structure that the cult's power flourished, for each priest believed the stability of the faith depended entirely on how fiercely they enforced its boundaries. Yet the most disturbing aspect of their formation was not the rituals they performed, but the emotional detachment they cultivated. Through countless hours of isolation, chanting, and ritual cleansing, they were trained to see acts of punishment not as cruelty, but as sacred duty. A renegade was not a person to them. They were an infection threatening the order that gave the priests their purpose. To hesitate was to show disloyalty, and disloyalty was treated as a spiritual fracture. Thus every priest, from the youngest acolyte to the oldest high guardian, internalized the doctrine that the survival of the faith required extinguishing doubt wherever it appeared. This mentality created a clergy both feared and revered. Their voices carried weight beyond the temple walls, shaping the collective psyche of entire communities. Their presence at ceremonies tightened the atmosphere, reminding followers that devotion must be absolute. And for the renegades who dared to stray, it was this very formation, this unwavering certainty embedded deep within the priests, that determined the terrifying precision of what would soon unfold in the darkness behind the temple gates. Within the rigid structure the priests upheld, certain acts were not simply frowned upon. They were considered wounds inflicted upon the very essence of the faith. These infractions, whispered about with dread among ordinary followers, were believed to unravel the delicate balance between devotion and divine wrath. A missed offering, spoken doubt, or hesitation during a ceremonial procession might earn suspicion, but there existed deeper transgressions. Those the cult deemed unforgivable. Renegades emerged not through rebellion alone, but through subtle human cracks the priests interpreted as threats to the sacred order. A faltering voice during a chant, a fearful glance at the sacrificial flames, or a quiet question about the necessity of a ritual could be enough to mark someone for intervention. In the eyes of Moloch's clergy, every infraction was symbolic. Doubt meant contamination. Hesitation meant impurity. And impurity, left unchecked, could spread, infecting families, entire neighborhoods, even the priesthood itself. This belief shaped the paranoia that governed the cult's internal judgment. Once an individual drew unwanted attention, the priests began a process of silent observation. Renegades were never accused immediately. Instead, they were evaluated, studied, their routines examined with predatory patience. The priests documented unusual behaviors, absences from gatherings, disrupted sleep patterns, or emotional distance during rituals. Even minor inconsistencies were carefully logged by scribes, though the records themselves were known only to the inner circle. The infractions considered truly unforgivable often revolved around sacred rites the cult guarded with obsessive secrecy. Interrupting a sacrificial preparation, Questioning the symbolism of the fire, or attempting to comfort a child marked for offering, were seen as acts of rebellion. More serious still were attempts to flee the temple grounds or persuade others to abandon the faith. Such actions were regarded as direct assaults on the god's dominion. Once branded a renegade, the person was no longer seen as a misguided believer, but as a vessel of corruption, a living contradiction to the doctrine Moloch's priests swore to enforce. And yet, the most terrifying aspect was that the accused seldom realized the gravity of their situation. The cult's system ensured the renegade continued living their ordinary life, while the priests built a case against them in shadows. Days, sometimes weeks, passed before any sign appeared that the clergy had turned their gaze upon them. A priest standing outside their home without explanation, a small symbol drawn on the path they walked, or the sudden silence of neighbors who feared being associated with them. These subtle changes were the first stirrings of the storm that would soon engulf them. Renegades were not chosen at random, but neither were they offered mercy. In every case, their infractions fed into a larger narrative crafted by the priests, a narrative where disobedience demanded a response equal to the perceived threat. The cult believed survival depended on absolute purity, and, for those who disrupted this purity, punishment was not merely a correction, it was a declaration, a warning, a ritual necessity meant to reinforce fear, stabilize devotion, and shape the fate of anyone who dared stray from the inferno-fed path the priests claimed was eternal truth. The first stage of punishment for a renegade was rarely physical. The priests of Moloch had mastered a more insidious form of control: psychological domination. Those marked for transgression found themselves under constant observation, their every action measured against the rigid standards of the temple. Eyes that had once offered comfort now followed them in silence, and whispers that seemed accidental carried messages of fear and inevitability. The renegade began to notice the subtle patterns: a ceremonial torch positioned where it shouldn't be, a low murmur among the initiates, a fleeting shadow in the corridor that felt too deliberate to ignore. It was the cultivation of unease, the deliberate erosion of certainty, and it worked like a slow-burning fire, consuming confidence and leaving raw anxiety in its place. Isolation was another key instrument. The priests ensured that the renegade had fewer and fewer allies. Friends, family, and even fellow worshippers were gradually distanced through persuasion, fear, or outright intimidation. Those who dared speak to the marked individual were reminded in veiled threats that association could jeopardize their own standing within the cult. This system of social control created an environment where trust itself became dangerous, and the renegade was forced to navigate a labyrinth where every step could be interpreted as defiance. Fear became an unrelenting companion, a shadow that clung to every action, thought, and whispered prayer. The priests also used subtle manipulation of ritual to reinforce their authority. Ceremonies that had once brought comfort now carried implicit threats. A missed step in a dance of fire, a hesitation in a chant, or the incorrect placement of an offering could be interpreted as proof of contamination, further solidifying the renegade's status as a target. The knowledge that every act was scrutinized created a cycle of self-doubt so powerful that even the most steadfast believer questioned their own intentions. Each failure, real or imagined, added weight to the invisible chain around their spirit. Yet even in this shadow of terror, the priests displayed calculated patience. They understood that breaking someone too quickly could backfire. A sudden display of punishment might inspire rebellion, sympathy, or martyrdom. Instead, they allowed fear to accumulate, shaping the renegade's behavior like molten metal forced into a mold. This psychological pressure was the first stage of a punishment designed not merely to correct behavior, but to transform it entirely, bending the will to the cult's rigid vision of devotion. As the days passed, the renegade began to feel the isolation, the scrutiny, and the weight of unseen judgment pressing down in ways that were almost imperceptible but relentless. It was during this phase that the seeds of despair and terror were sown, preparing them for what came next. Ceremonies and trials that tested not just loyalty, but survival itself. These early acts of control were both a warning and a demonstration, showing that the priest's power was absolute and that resistance would not go unnoticed. If you have ever wondered how fear can shape the mind, or if you imagine what it might feel like to live under the constant gaze of invisible eyes, share your thoughts below. Your insight might reveal something about the human capacity to endure and help us understand why those who dared defy Moloch faced such relentless scrutiny. The next phase of punishment escalated from psychological torment to ritualized enforcement, designed to erode the renegade's spirit while maintaining the illusion of sanctity. The priests of Moloch understood that fear alone could shape obedience, but ritualized suffering reinforced the lesson in ways that terror in isolation could not. Those who had drawn suspicion were gradually introduced to ceremonies that masqueraded as purification. Yet each act carried the weight of control, reinforcing the absolute authority of the clergy. It began subtly. A fasting period extended beyond ordinary practice, a chant repeated until the voice cracked, the body shivering with exhaustion. These exercises, framed as devotion, were actually tests of endurance, loyalty, and submission. In addition to physical discipline, the priests employed symbolic acts that communicated power and inevitability. Ritual markings, carefully applied and never fully explained, designated the renegade as marked for correction. Each symbol was a reminder of the divine order and a warning that deviation could result in consequences far worse than pain alone. The act of marking was accompanied by ceremonial phrases, often cryptic, that embedded a psychological weight deeper than any corporeal punishment. These phrases echoed in the mind long after the ritual ended, shaping perception and eroding the will. The renegade became acutely aware that every choice, every gesture, was under scrutiny, and that their fate was intertwined with the whims of those who controlled the sacred fires. Purification ceremonies escalated according to the degree of perceived transgression. Minor infractions led to trials of endurance and repetitive acts of penance, while more serious deviations introduced elements of humiliation and sensory deprivation. The priests wielded these ceremonies with precision, understanding that the human psyche could be molded by isolation, deprivation, and repetition. In some instances, renegades were made to observe the rituals of others, witnessing punishment and submission as lessons in obedience. The display reinforced the hierarchy and instilled the notion that resistance was both futile and shameful. Observation became a weapon, as much a part of the ritual as the ceremonial flame itself. Even as the punishments became more severe, the priests maintained an aura of sanctity. The acts were framed as necessary, righteous, and inevitable. Every trial was cloaked in religious justification, and the renegade was left to reconcile their suffering with the belief that it was divinely sanctioned. This manipulation of perception was crucial, as it bound the individual's understanding of pain to a higher purpose, making rebellion not only dangerous, but morally impermissible. Through these ceremonies, the cult reinforced its control, bending the human spirit while maintaining the illusion of sacred obligation. By the end of this stage, the renegade was thoroughly conditioned. Physical endurance, symbolic marking, and ritualized humiliation combined to shape a person whose identity was no longer solely their own. They had been recast in the image of the cult's doctrine, ready for the next phase, where the most extreme rituals awaited, trials that would test the boundaries of fear, submission, and the human soul. It was in these ceremonies that the true extent of the priest's power became unmistakable, and the renegade realized that the flames of Moloch's judgment reached far beyond the altar. Beneath the towering temples and ceremonial courtyards, hidden chambers held the darkest secrets of the priest's authority. These rooms, sealed from public view, were places where the true power of Moloch was exercised away from prying eyes. Only the highest-ranking clergy knew their locations, and access was granted sparingly, often as a test of loyalty or endurance. The renegades, once brought to these clandestine spaces, were confronted with an environment designed to disorient and intimidate. The walls were etched with cryptic symbols. Flames flickered in oil-fed braziers, casting distorted shadows, and the air itself seemed heavy with the residue of generations, of ritual. Every element was calculated to break preconceptions, reshape fear, and enforce submission. In these chambers, the rituals took on forms too secretive for the open temple. Priests performed ceremonies that combined psychological manipulation with sensory deprivation. Eyes were blindfolded, ears filled with low chants, and limbs sometimes restrained, rendering the renegade acutely aware of every sound, movement, and breath. The isolation magnified every thought, every memory, every fear. What had once been an ordinary sense of self became fragmented, leaving the individual vulnerable to suggestion and completely dependent on the priests for guidance, approval, or reprieve. In these hidden spaces, the boundaries between punishment and devotion blurred, making each act of obedience both a relief and a further tightening of control. The secret chambers also served as classrooms for the priests themselves. Here, they refined their methods, experimenting with combinations of ritual, symbolism, and psychological stress to observe their effects. The scribes, when permitted, recorded fragments in coded manuscripts, never revealing full details lest the knowledge spread beyond the inner circle. Over centuries, these practices evolved into intricate patterns of discipline and indoctrination, forming a system that was as methodical as it was merciless. Every renegade brought into these rooms became both a student and a subject, their reactions guiding the next iteration of ritual enforcement. The deeper one descended into these chambers, the more the environment shifted. Floors sloped unpredictably, chambers divided into maze-like corridors, and subtle sounds, creaking beams, dripping water, distant chanting, disoriented and reinforced a sense of entrapment. The renegade's perception of time warped, and the isolation intensified the psychological impact. In these spaces, priests wielded authority not just over action, but over thought, shaping obedience at its core. A single glance from an elder could instill the same dread that would take months to manifest in the open temple, while a whispered phrase could unravel hours of defiance. Through these hidden practices, the cult maintained its most potent power: invisibility. The horrors of the secret chambers remained unknown to the general populace, and even those within the temple who had not yet been initiated could sense only fragments of the methods employed. The renegade who survived exposure to these clandestine rituals emerged forever altered, aware that their own mind had been a battlefield for control. And it was here, in these chambers of shadows and fire, that the priests of Moloch solidified their dominion over both faith and fear, preparing for the moments when they would impose judgment in ways that left no doubt of their absolute authority. The ritual of judgment, as carried out by the priests of Moloch, was the culmination of observation, manipulation, and psychological preparation. The renegade, now fully aware of their precarious position, was brought before a sacred assembly in a chamber that combined intimidation with spectacle. The walls were lined with symbols of divine authority, and the braziers blazed with flames that cast flickering shadows over the faces of high priests. These figures, cloaked in ritual garments, represented both ultimate power and moral certainty. The ritual itself was not merely punishment. It was theater designed to enforce the hierarchy and reaffirm the supremacy of the faith over the individual. Renegades were subjected to public and private components of judgment simultaneously. They would kneel on the cold stone floor, while priests recited liturgies intended to humiliate, correct, and instill fear. Subtle marks were made on their skin, not to inflict lasting physical damage, but to signal their status as offenders to other initiates and worshippers. These symbols carried meaning that only the clergy could interpret, creating a permanent psychological imprint. Every gesture, every word, every movement of the priests was orchestrated to communicate absolute authority. The renegade's response was analyzed, noted, and interpreted as evidence of repentance or continued defiance. The humiliation extended beyond the renegade's personal experience. Witnesses, other initiates, lower-ranking priests, or occasionally select members of the congregation, observed from designated positions. Their silence, enforced through ritual and fear, magnified the effect. The renegade's suffering was not just a lesson to them, but a demonstration of the cult's power, creating a network of compliance through observation. Those present learned, through example, that deviation from the sacred code had consequences that were both inescapable and eternal. Each act of judgment reinforced the priest's narrative. Moloch demanded absolute loyalty, and any lapse would be corrected with precision and certainty. As the ritual progressed, the priests escalated the severity of the acts. Threats were communicated through controlled gestures and symbolic implements. Some meant to intimidate, others to signify impending consequences. The renegade often experienced a mixture of relief and terror, as small gestures of leniency were interspersed with symbolic punishments. This oscillation created a heightened psychological tension, breaking down resistance while reinforcing submission. The most cunning aspect of this ritual was that it left the renegade constantly questioning whether they had done enough to appease the god or the priests, ensuring the imprint of fear would endure long after the ceremony concluded. The culmination of the judgment was both solemn and terrifying. The renegade left the chamber visibly marked, their status in the community altered, their psyche forever shaped by the experience. This ritual, while hidden from public view, served a dual purpose. It purified the offender according to the cult's understanding of divine law, and it sent a clear message to any who might consider defiance. For those watching and surviving, the lesson was unmistakable. Obedience was safety, and deviation, no matter how small, would be met with consequences beyond imagination. If you can imagine witnessing such a judgment and the way fear becomes a tool for control, leave a comment below with your thoughts. How do you think the mind responds when every action is measured against unseen, unrelenting authority? Your perspective could reveal just how deeply such rituals shape both victims and observers. The scribes of the Moloch priesthood held a power that rivaled even the highest-ranking clergy. Tasked with recording the inner workings of the cult, they documented rituals, observations, and punishments, with painstaking precision. Yet, their records were neither neutral nor complete. They were instruments of control, designed to preserve secrecy and enforce the authority of the priests. Every line etched onto clay tablets or scrolls reinforced the hierarchy, codifying what was permissible and exposing what would be punished. For the renegades, these records were invisible chains, shaping their fate before they even realized they had transgressed. These scribes worked in dimly lit chambers, often underground or in hidden libraries, surrounded by scrolls, ink, and the scent of burning oils. They documented not only the acts themselves, but the subtle nuances of behavior. Hesitation in a chant, trembling hands during a ritual, a gaze that lingered too long on the flames. Each notation served as a template for future enforcement, a record of what behaviors indicated defiance, doubt, or moral weakness. The scribes' work ensured that the priest's power was cumulative. Lessons learned from one renegade could be applied to countless others, creating a self-perpetuating system of observation, judgment, and punishment. The manipulation of memory was another critical function of the scribes. Records were selectively preserved or destroyed, erasing evidence that might contradict the narrative of divine authority. Names could be omitted, incidents rewritten, and outcomes reframed to maintain the illusion that obedience was universal and rebellion was anomalous. This control over history and memory extended the reach of the priests beyond the immediate ritual, influencing how communities understood faith, devotion, and authority. The fear of becoming a footnote in the sacred record reinforced compliance as effectively as any ceremony. The scribes were also responsible for codifying secret symbols and marks used in the punishment of renegades. These marks, etched in hidden places or applied in rituals, carried meanings known only to the initiated. They functioned as psychological triggers, reminders that the priesthood was always watching and that defiance was never truly private. The meticulous recording of such practices allowed the priests to maintain continuity, ensuring that no ritual, punishment, or lesson was lost to time. Each document was a blueprint, guiding future enforcement and teaching new priests the art of subtle domination. By controlling knowledge, observation, and memory, the scribes became essential architects of the cult's power. Their records transformed fear into a precise, systemic instrument, binding the community to the priest's authority. For renegades, these hidden writings represented a silent but omnipresent threat, a constant reminder that deviation could be traced, recorded, and punished with ruthless consistency. The clerical bureaucracy created an invisible cage, one from which escape was nearly impossible, and one that ensured the priests of Moloch could perpetuate their dominion across generations with calculated efficiency. The final stage in the priest's system for handling renegades was the execution of ultimate control, the disappearance and assimilation of the individual into a cycle of fear and silence. Those who survived the chambers, the punishments, and the rituals often faced a fate that went beyond physical torment. The priests understood that the ultimate lesson for the faithful was not merely to punish, but to erase the possibility of defiance entirely. Disappearance became the final act, a strategy to remind communities that rebellion, no matter how subtle, carried consequences that transcended the individual. Renegades who reached this stage were removed from public view under the guise of divine necessity. Some were taken to remote temples or sanctified compounds, never to be seen by ordinary worshippers again. Others were absorbed into the temple's hidden labor systems, performing menial or secretive tasks that were officially unrecorded. In these cases, the individuals were alive, yet stripped of identity, their previous roles and social connections obliterated. The priests wielded this control as a form of living punishment, where isolation, repetitive labor, and constant surveillance became instruments of psychological endurance. Each step reinforced the doctrine that absolute obedience was the only path to stability. Ongoing ceremonies ensured that even in disappearance, the renegade's presence was felt. Rituals invoked their name or a symbolic representation, reinforcing the idea that the priests maintained absolute oversight. These acts were not intended as mercy or rehabilitation. They were calculated to instill dread, emphasizing that the cult's reach extended beyond what the human eye could see. Within the community, the ambiguity of the renegade's fate generated fear and compliance. Everyone who observed or heard tales of disappearances understood that the priests could act without public spectacle, enforcing authority silently yet thoroughly. The knowledge of what could happen to a transgressor was as powerful as witnessing it directly. At the same time, these measures preserved the sacred secrecy of the temple. Records of disappearances were encoded or limited to trusted scribes, ensuring that only a select few understood the mechanisms behind the vanishing. By manipulating memory and history, the priests maintained an aura of invincibility and omniscience. Rumors, whispered in marketplaces or around fires, suggested horrors that might or might not have occurred. But the uncertainty itself became a weapon. Fear, as much as ritual or flame, maintained the hierarchy. For the renegades, this final stage represented both annihilation and endurance. Physically alive yet socially erased, they embodied the cult's power, absolute control over life, identity, and memory. Their disappearance served as a reminder to others that rebellion was not merely punished. It was absorbed into a system of fear that perpetuated itself across generations. In this way, the priests of Moloch ensured that the cycle of obedience remained unbroken, and the shadow of their authority extended far beyond the visible temple, shaping societies and instilling terror that echoed silently through both time and memory. The repercussions of the priests' actions extended far beyond the temple walls, resonating throughout neighboring communities and across generations. The stories of those who defied Moloch, whether whispered in fear or recorded in cryptic texts, served as cautionary tales, embedding the cult's power in the collective consciousness. Entire villages learned, through silence and example, that obedience was not simply a personal choice, but a survival strategy. The fear instilled by the priests transcended individual renegades. It became a tool to maintain social order, enforce hierarchy, and shape human behavior long after the flames had dimmed. These practices created an environment where communities internalized surveillance and punishment, adopting the priests' rigorous standards as unwritten law. Even those who had never seen the inner sanctums or experienced the secret rituals knew the consequences of defiance through stories of disappearance, public humiliation, or subtle symbolic marks. In this way, the cult's influence extended like an invisible web, binding not only the faithful but the fearful, ensuring that doubt was silenced before it could take root. The priests understood that terror, like devotion, could be inherited, passed down in whispers, gestures, and cultural memory, leaving an indelible imprint on the psyche of entire societies. Over centuries, these acts shaped religious and social hierarchies, influencing alliances, governance, and even the legal structures of neighboring territories. The lessons of fear and control were absorbed, adapted, and sometimes misinterpreted, yet their core principle remained: the absolute authority of the divine, and those who claim to channel it must not be questioned. What scholars and archaeologists uncover today, fragments of texts, markings in hidden chambers, accounts passed through generations, offers glimpses into a system of governance that fused faith, fear, and bureaucracy into a single, terrifying instrument of compliance. It is a legacy that reminds us how devotion, when weaponized, can dictate not only belief, but the very structure of society. If you've followed the journey of these renegades and witnessed the lengths to which the priests of Moloch went to maintain control, take a moment to reflect and share your thoughts in the comments. A simple phrase like, "This message was for me," or "I can't believe this survived," shows that you've engaged with the story, and your perspective adds value to the discussion. Make sure you click like if you found this exploration enlightening, and check whether you're subscribed so you don't miss the next deep dive into hidden histories. There's another video waiting that complements this story perfectly, offering even more insight into the rituals, the power, and the terrifying influence of ancient secret orders. Click over and continue the journey with us. You'll see that understanding the past is the key to uncovering truths that are both shocking and essential to remember.